The war was over. At least that is what the report said. The big ships had stopped firing. The treaties had been signed. The generals had shaken hands and gone home. But nobody told the ruins. Nobody told the ash still floating through the cold air like gray snow. Nobody told the burned shells of buildings that used to be something. And nobody told Cole. He walked slowly through the destruction, his boots crunching on broken stone with every step. His rifle was in his hands, but he was not really looking for threats. There were no threats left. Everyone knew that. The enemy was gone. The war was done. Cole was simply here because he did not know where else to be. The nesting ground had once been something beautiful. Cole could tell even now, even through all the damage. The structures were different from anything humans built. They were curved and smooth, made from some kind of dark stone that had a faint shine to it even under all the dust. The dragon people had built their nests in wide bowl shapes, low to the ground, lined with something soft that had mostly burned away now. There were dozens of them, spread across a wide open area surrounded by tall broken walls. Most of the nests were crushed. Some had taken direct hits from the bombing raids. Others had simply collapsed when the walls around them fell. Cole moved between them slowly. This was not his first sweep of the area. It was his fourth. His commanding officer had told him the zone was clear. Told him 3 times, in fact, with the kind of voice that meant stop going back there. But Cole kept coming back. He was not sure why. He told himself it was duty. It was easier than telling himself the truth. The truth was that he did not want to go back to camp. Camp meant the other soldiers. The other soldiers meant talking. Talking meant questions he could not answer, like how are you holding up and have you eaten today and do you want to talk about what happened out there? Cole did not want to talk about what happened out there. What happened out there was that 6 people he had known for 3 years were gone in less than 4 minutes. What happened out there was that Cole had been the only one who walked away. And no amount of talking was going to change that. So he walked through the ruins instead. The ash and the silence felt more honest than the noise of camp. At least here, nothing pretended everything was fine. He moved past a collapsed wall, stepping carefully over the rubble. The sky above was the wrong color, the way it always was on this planet. A kind of deep greenish-gray, heavy and low, like a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. The light it gave off was dim and flat, making everything look like an old photograph. Cole had stopped noticing it weeks ago. Now it just looked like sky. He was about to turn back toward the far edge of the nesting ground when he heard it. It was small. Very small. Almost nothing. Just a faint sound somewhere between a scrape and a breath, coming from somewhere beneath a pile of collapsed stone and burned wood to his left. Cole stopped walking. He stood completely still and listened. Silence. He waited. Then it came again. Soft. Irregular. Like something trying very hard not to make noise and not quite managing it. Cole moved toward the sound carefully, stepping over the outer edge of a ruined nest. The pile of rubble here was chest high, a mix of broken stone slabs and charred beams that had fallen inward on themselves. Whatever was underneath was not visible from where he stood. He crouched down and looked for gaps. There. Low to the ground. A narrow dark space between 2 large slabs of fallen stone where something had created a small hollow. Cole could not see inside it properly. The light was too dim and the angle was wrong. He set his rifle down slowly, making as little noise as possible, and lowered himself onto one knee. He tilted his head and looked into the gap. 2 eyes looked back at him. Cole went very still. The eyes were large, larger than they should have been on something that small, with vertical pupils that caught what little light there was and reflected it back in faint gold. They were watching him with an expression Cole could not fully read. Not the blind animal panic he might have expected. Not aggression. Something more complicated than either of those things. Something that looked almost careful. Like whatever was in there was thinking very hard about what to do next. Cole did not move. He did not speak. He just stayed where he was and let the thing in the dark decide. After a long moment something shifted in the shadows. The small creature moved forward, just slightly, bringing its face closer to the gap. Cole could see it better now. A hatchling. A dragon hatchling, barely bigger than a large dog, with scales that should have probably been some bright color but were currently so coated in gray ash that it was hard to tell what they looked like underneath. Its wings were folded tight against its body. Its legs were tucked under it in a way that made it look as small as possible. It was trembling. Cole had seen dragon soldiers before. Everyone who had served in this war had. They were enormous, powerful creatures, easily 3 times the height of a human being, with scales like armor plating and voices like low thunder when they spoke. They were not easy things to stand in front of. But this was not that. This was something so much smaller and so much younger that it barely seemed like the same kind of creature at all. This was, Cole realized with a slow and quiet understanding, a child. A child who had been hiding under a pile of rubble, alone, and had been found by a human soldier holding a gun. He moved the gun further away from himself without breaking eye contact. Just pushed it a little to the side so it was clearly not in his hands. The hatchling watched him do it. They stayed like that for a while. Cole on one knee in the ash. The hatchling pressed into its hollow in the dark, trembling and watching. Then the hatchling's scales shifted. Just slightly. Underneath all the ash, something moved, like color trying to surface through dirty water. Cole had read about this in the briefings, years ago before the war started, back when humans and dragon people were still learning about each other. Dragon scales could carry communication. Light and color patterns that worked like language when words were not enough or not yet learned. He could not read it. He did not know enough to understand what the colors meant. But the shift itself, the fact that the hatchling was trying to communicate at all, told him something. It told him the hatchling was not purely running on fear and instinct. Something else was happening inside that small creature. Something was thinking and reaching and trying. Cole sat down fully on the ground. He made himself as small as he reasonably could, which was not very small since he was a grown human man in military gear, but the gesture seemed to matter. He put his hands in his lap where they were visible and empty. He waited. The hatchling looked at his hands. Then at his face. Then at his hands again. Then it spoke. The sound it made was not quite like the dragon language Cole had heard from soldiers. It was softer, less formed, the way a child's voice is before it fully learns the shape of words. But the translation chip embedded behind Cole's ear, standard issue for all soldiers operating in multi-species zones, caught it anyway and rendered it into something he could understand. 3 words. Simple and quiet and completely unexpected. Why are you alone? Cole opened his mouth. Closed it again. He had been asked a lot of questions in his life. He had been asked questions in debriefings and in medical evaluations and in the long careful conversations that officers have with soldiers who have seen too much. Nobody had asked him that. Not like that. Not so directly. Not in a voice that sounded like it genuinely wanted to know. He looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back at him. Around them the ruins were silent and the ash was still floating down from somewhere and the wrong-colored sky sat heavy and low overhead. Cole felt something move in his chest. Something he had been keeping very carefully locked up since the day his unit died. He took a slow breath. And he began to answer. Cole did not answer right away. He sat on the cold ground in the middle of the ruins and looked at the hatchling in the gap between the fallen stones and tried to find the right words. The problem was that he had been avoiding the right words for weeks. He had been using other words instead. Words like fine and managing and just doing my job. Words that kept people from asking more questions. Words that built a wall fast enough that nobody ever got close enough to see what was behind it. But this hatchling was not a person. She was not a commanding officer or a camp medic or a fellow soldier with their own grief to carry. She was a small trembling creature who had just asked him something honest in a voice that had no agenda behind it. No file to fill out. No box to check. Just a question that wanted an answer. Cole looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked back at her. Everyone I came with is gone, he said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Rough at the edges, like something that had not been used properly in a while. The translation chip behind his ear worked both ways in close range, converting his words into the soft scale-light signals the hatchling could understand. He saw the faint shimmer move across her ash-covered scales as his words reached her. She did not move. She just listened. So Cole kept going. He told her that he had come to this planet with 6 people. Not just soldiers, though they were that too. People he had eaten with and complained with and laughed with during the long boring stretches between the dangerous ones. People who knew how he took his coffee and what he looked like when he was trying not to show he was scared and which particular silence of his meant he was fine versus which one meant he was not fine at all. 6 people who carried small pieces of him simply by knowing him well enough. And then, in less than 4 minutes on a day that had started like any other day, they were gone. Cole did not describe the battle. He had described it enough times in enough reports that the words had stopped meaning anything. What he told the hatchling instead was what happened after. How he had walked back to the base that evening and sat down on his bunk and waited to feel something that made sense. How the feeling never came. How the days after that were strange and flat, like living inside a picture of his life instead of actually living it. How everyone around him kept moving forward and he kept standing in the same place in the same moment, unable to figure out how to take the next step when the next step meant accepting that those 6 people were never going to be there again. I don't know how to go back, he said. Back home, I mean. Back to the way things were before. Because the way things were before had them in it. And now it doesn't. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. He stopped talking. The ruins were very quiet. Somewhere far away the wind moved through a broken wall and made a low hollow sound, but other than that there was nothing. Just Cole sitting in the ash and the hatchling watching him from her small dark hollow. Then she made a sound. It was not a word. The translation chip did not render it as language because it was not quite language. It was something underneath language, something older and more direct. A low sound that started somewhere deep in her small chest and moved up and out of her slowly, like something heavy being lifted. Cole felt it more than he heard it. It moved through the air and settled against him like a hand placed carefully on a shoulder. He recognized it somehow even though he had never heard it before. He recognized it the way you recognize certain things without being taught them. Grief. That was what it was. The sound of grief from a creature small enough to fit under a pile of rubble, grieving something she did not yet have enough words to explain. Her scales shifted again under the ash. Colors moved through them slowly. Deep and dark, blues and purples bleeding into each other like bruises. Cole watched them and felt the translation chip doing something softer than its usual work, not converting language but giving him the shape of what the colors meant. Sadness. Loss. Recognition. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The hatchling moved. Slowly, carefully, she shifted forward out of the hollow, pulling herself through the gap between the fallen stones and into the open air for the first time since Cole had found her. She was even smaller than she had looked in the dark. Her legs were thin and unsteady. Her wings were pressed so tightly to her body they almost disappeared. She was covered head to tail in gray ash and she was still trembling, but she moved forward anyway, one careful step at a time, across the rubble toward Cole. He stayed completely still. He did not reach for her. He did not make any sudden movements. He just sat there on the ground with his hands in his lap and let her come. She stopped about an arm's length away from him and looked at him with those large gold-reflected eyes. Up close he could see her more clearly. She was young, very young, probably not long out of the egg by the look of her. Her scales, under the ash, had the slightly soft unset look of hatchling scales that had not yet hardened fully. Her face had that particular quality that very young creatures have across almost every species Cole had ever encountered, something in the proportions that reads immediately as young, as new, as not yet fully arrived into the world. She had been alone in that hollow for a long time. He could see it in the way she held herself. The careful stillness of something that had learned to take up as little space as possible because taking up space might be dangerous. Cole understood that feeling. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her scales shifted again and the translation chip gave him one word. Same. Cole felt something move through him that he did not have a name for. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. Same. She took the last step forward and pressed her head against his arm. Not hard. Just a small careful pressure, like she was testing whether he would pull away. He did not pull away. He stayed where he was and let her rest her head against him, and after a moment he felt the trembling in her begin to slow down, just slightly, the way trembling does when something cold finally finds warmth. They sat like that for a while. After some time Cole asked her, quietly, if she had a name. The scale light shifted across her in a pattern the chip caught and translated. The sound it rendered was soft and short. Sarah. Cole said it back to her carefully, making sure he had it right. Sarah. She lifted her head and looked at him when he said it. Her scales flashed briefly with something warm, a pale gold moving through the gray ash coating like light through cloud. The chip told him what it meant in the way it sometimes could with strong clear signals. No. Bird. He asked what the name meant, not really expecting an answer. But Sarah's scales moved again in a slow deliberate pattern, colors shifting through deep amber and fading orange, and the chip worked at it for a moment before giving him the closest translation it could find. The last warmth before dark. Cole was quiet for a long time after that. He looked at this small ashy creature leaning against his arm in the ruins of her home and thought about that name and thought about what it meant that someone had given it to her. That she had been born into a family that looked at her and found warmth in her. A family that was now gone the same way his was gone. The last warmth before dark. He thought that was one of the saddest and most beautiful things he had ever heard. The wrong-colored sky above them had shifted toward evening, the greenish-gray deepening into something darker. The ash had mostly settled. The ruins around them were very still. Cole did not get up to go back to camp. He stayed where he was, on the cold ground, with Sarah pressed quietly against his side, and for the first time in weeks the frozen place inside him where his unit used to be felt something other than cold. Not healed. Not fixed. Just slightly, carefully less alone. Cole did not go back to camp that night. He told himself it was because it was getting dark and the walk back was long and the terrain was uneven in the low light. He told himself it was a practical decision. A safety decision. He was good at telling himself things that were easier than the truth. The truth was that he looked at Sarah pressed against his side in the ruins and could not make himself stand up and walk away from her. So he stayed. He had enough basic gear on him to make it work for one night. A compact thermal sheet folded into his side pack, the kind that reflected body heat back and kept a person warm even in cold conditions. A small light torch that ran on a battery that would last a few days. 2 ration bars and a water filter unit that could process the local groundwater into something safe to drink. Soldiers in peacekeeping roles carried these things without thinking about it. Cole had packed them that morning out of habit without expecting to actually need them. He found a section of the ruins where 2 walls were still mostly standing and met at an angle, creating a natural corner that blocked the wind from 2 sides. The ground there was flat enough. He cleared away the larger pieces of rubble with his hands and boot, making a space wide enough for him to sit and stretch out if he needed to. Sarah watched him do all of this from a few steps away, her head tilted slightly to one side, her scales cycling through slow quiet colors that the translation chip mostly rendered as curiosity. When he unfolded the thermal sheet and sat down against the wall, she stayed where she was and watched him. Cole tore open one of the ration bars and ate half of it slowly. Then he looked at Sarah. She was thin. Even under the ash he could see it now that he was paying attention. The way her ribs showed slightly when she breathed. The way her legs looked too narrow for the rest of her body. She had been in that hollow for a long time without proper food and it showed. He held out the other half of the ration bar. Sarah looked at it. Then at him. Then at it again. Cole did not push it toward her. He just held it out and waited. After a long moment she stepped forward and sniffed it carefully. Her expression shifted into something that was probably the dragon hatchling version of uncertainty. Cole did not blame her. Military ration bars were not exciting food for humans either. But she was hungry enough that uncertainty lost, and she took it carefully from his hand and ate it in 2 small bites. She looked up at him after. Cole nodded at her. "We'll find you something better tomorrow," he said. Her scales flickered pale gold. The chip said the same thing it had said before. No. Hurt. That was the first night. The days that followed built on each other slowly, the way trust always does, through small things repeated until they stopped feeling small. Cole went back to camp the next morning and told his commanding officer that he had found a surviving hatchling in the nesting ground and was going to stay in the area for a few days to assess the situation. His commanding officer looked at him for a long moment with an expression that said several things at once, most of them concerned. But the peacekeeping mandate included provisions for civilian life forms and Cole knew the regulations well enough to make it sound official. Permission was granted, reluctantly, with a request for daily check-in signals. Cole gathered proper supplies. Better rations, including some protein packs that the camp nutritionist said should work for young dragon physiology based on the general species dietary files in the system. A larger thermal cover. A proper water supply. Some basic medical items in case Sarah had injuries he had not yet been able to check. When he came back to the ruins, Sarah was in the corner shelter he had built the night before. She had not left it. She looked up when he appeared at the edge of the broken wall and her scales flashed immediately, a quick warm movement of color that the chip caught as recognition and something close to relief. She had waited for him. Cole set his pack down and sat beside her and did not make a big thing of it. He just started unpacking the supplies and talking to her quietly about nothing important, the way he used to talk to the members of his unit during slow hours. What the camp was like. What the sky had looked like that morning. Small ordinary things said in a calm voice. Sarah listened with her head tilted and her scales moving in slow gentle patterns. Over the next several days a routine took shape. Cole would wake early, do his check-in signal to camp, then spend the day in the ruins with Sarah. He improved the shelter, adding a third wall using larger pieces of rubble stacked carefully, and rigged the thermal cover overhead to block the wind. He found a water source nearby that the filter unit could process reliably. He kept the area clean and quiet. Sarah began to move more freely. On the second day she explored the edges of the shelter while Cole was working. On the third day she followed him when he went to refill the water supply, staying close to his heels like a shadow. On the fourth day she made a sound he had not heard from her before, a short quick chirp that the chip did not render as a full word but felt something like amusement, when Cole tripped over a piece of rubble and caught himself badly. He looked back at her and she looked at him and he laughed, actually laughed for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember. Sarah's scales flashed bright gold. He started learning her colors more carefully. Pale green meant she was calm and felt safe. Deep blue was sadness, the heavy slow kind. Bright gold was happiness or something close to it. A quick silver ripple meant she was alert and paying attention. Dark red at the edges of her scales meant fear, the kind that made her want to make herself small and still. She started learning him too. She watched the way he moved and figured out that slow, careful movements meant he was being deliberate and gentle. She figured out that when he sat down fully on the ground he was not going anywhere for a while. She figured out that he always checked on her before he went to sleep and that he was always there when she woke up. On the 5th day she climbed into his lap while he was sitting against the wall eating his morning ration and simply went to sleep there. Cole sat very still for a long time, not wanting to wake her. His back started to ache from not moving. He did not move anyway. He was not sure exactly when the thing that was happening between them stopped being a peacekeeping assessment and started being something else. There was no clear moment. It just shifted gradually, the way light shifts in the morning, not all at once but steadily, until suddenly the world looks different from how it looked before. He was sitting outside the shelter on the morning of the 7th day, watching Sarah practice opening and closing her wings in the open space of the ruined nesting ground, when he heard it. A low steady hum from above. He looked up. Through the gray-green sky, moving slowly over the far edge of the ruined colony, was a ship. Not human. The shape was wrong for human design. It was long and curved along the underside, with a dark metallic color and running lights in deep amber. Cole had seen ships like this in briefings. Dragon patrol vessels. Military grade, used by the Varrock Clutch Council forces for post-war zone assessments and survivor recovery operations. His first thought was practical. A surviving hatchling had been found. The patrol would take Sarah. She would be safe. She would be with her own kind. This was the right outcome. This was what was supposed to happen. He turned to tell Sarah. She was already looking at the ship. She had heard it before he did. She stood completely still in the middle of the open ground, her wings half open, staring up at the vessel moving overhead. Her scales were cycling through colors fast, too fast for the chip to render cleanly. Then the dark red appeared. The fear color. It crept from the edges of her scales inward and she made herself small, pulling her wings tight to her body, lowering her head. Then she turned away from the ship. She walked directly to Cole and pressed herself against his legs and her scales shifted into pale green. The color he knew. The color that meant safe. The color that meant trust. The patrol ship descended toward the far end of the nesting ground, its landing gear extending as it dropped below the broken walls. Cole stood very still with Sarah against his legs and watched it land. The side door opened. 3 dragon soldiers stepped out. Large, armored, moving with the careful controlled purpose of trained military personnel. They scanned the area. Then one of them saw Cole. All 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him and did not look away. The dragon soldiers did not hurt Cole. They were not gentle either. They moved with the kind of controlled efficiency that military training produces across almost every species, quick and precise and leaving very little room for argument. 2 of them positioned themselves on either side of him while the third crouched down and looked at Sarah with an expression Cole could not fully read. Sarah pressed harder against Cole's legs and her scales burned dark red. The soldier who had crouched down spoke to Sarah in the full dragon language, deep and layered, too complex for Cole's basic translation chip to catch completely. He got pieces of it. Words like safe and home and come. Sarah did not move toward the soldier. She did not respond in scale light or sound. She just stayed where she was and the dark red on her scales did not fade. The soldier stood back up and looked at Cole. Cole kept his hands visible and his voice calm. He explained who he was. His name, his unit designation, his peacekeeping mandate. He explained that he had found Sarah alone in the ruins 7 days ago and had stayed to care for her. He kept the explanation simple and factual because simple and factual was the language soldiers understood. The dragon soldier listened. Then he said something the chip rendered clearly enough. You will come with us. It was not a question. Cole looked down at Sarah. She was looking up at him with those large gold-reflected eyes and her scales were doing something complicated, colors moving through each other in a way the chip struggled to untangle. But underneath all of it the pale green was still there. The trust color. Still there even now. Okay, Cole said quietly to the soldier and to Sarah both. They were taken aboard the patrol vessel. The inside was built for dragon physiology, which meant the ceilings were high and the spaces were wide and everything felt slightly too large for a human being. Cole was placed in a seat that had clearly been designed for someone much bigger than him and given a basic restraint that did not quite fit properly. Sarah was placed in a separate area, a low padded section near the back that looked like it was designed for hatchling transport. She craned her neck to keep Cole in her line of sight the whole time and her scales stayed a steady unhappy blue. Cole watched her until a partition slid closed between them. The flight was not long. They were taken to a regional outpost of the Varrock Clutch Council, a large complex of buildings on the edge of what had once been a major dragon settlement. The settlement itself was damaged from the war, but the outpost was operational, rebuilt and running. There were dragon soldiers moving through the corridors and administrative staff working at stations, and the general organized activity of an institution that had a lot of work to do and was doing it. Cole was brought through corridors that felt like walking through a world built entirely without him in mind and placed in a waiting room that was at least partially sized for smaller species. Someone brought him water. Nobody spoke to him. After about an hour he was taken into a large chamber. The Varrock Clutch Council chamber was built in a wide circle, with raised curved seating that went up in tiers around the perimeter. At least a dozen council members were present, seated in the upper tiers, looking down at the open floor below. They were older than the soldiers, larger in some ways that had nothing to do with physical size, carrying the particular weight that authority puts on a person over many years. At the far end of the curved tiers, slightly elevated above the others, sat the elder members. Cole counted 5 of them. He was placed in the center of the open floor. The space around him felt very large. Sarah was brought in separately and placed in a sectioned area to the side, separated from Cole by a low barrier. She looked at him immediately when she entered, and her scales ran pale green for just a moment before shifting back to the complicated mix of colors she had been wearing since they boarded the patrol ship. A council member near the center spoke. The chip worked hard and gave Cole most of it. The accusation, laid out formally and without particular anger, was this. A human soldier had been found in a restricted post-war zone in the company of a dragon hatchling. The hatchling showed signs of malnourishment consistent with extended isolation. The human had not reported the discovery through proper channels. The human had remained in the zone for 7 days without official authorization for extended stay. Given the history of the war and the known behavior of opposing forces, the council had reasonable grounds to believe the hatchling had been held against her will as a psychological asset or war prize. Cole listened to all of it. When the council member finished speaking there was a pause, the kind that meant Cole was expected to respond. He thought about the kind of response that a soldier is trained to give in a formal review. Structured. Referenced. Citing regulations and mandates and the specific language of the peacekeeping agreement that technically did cover his presence in the zone. He decided against it. He looked up at the council members looking down at him and he said the only thing that felt true. I found her alone, he said. She was hiding under the rubble and she was trembling and she hadn't eaten in a long time. I couldn't leave her there. The chip translated. The chamber was quiet. A council member in the second tier spoke. The chip gave Cole the shape of the question. Why had he not reported the discovery immediately and requested a recovery team? Cole thought about how to answer that honestly. I was going to, he said. But she was scared. She was scared of everything and she trusted me and I didn't want to leave before she was okay enough to be left. Another question. How did he know she trusted him? She told me, Cole said. A brief pause. The council member asked how a hatchling communicated trust to a human soldier. She stopped shaking, Cole said simply. And she climbed into my lap and went to sleep. The chamber was not silent exactly, but something in the quality of the sound changed. Cole could not identify what. The questioning continued. They asked about the rations he had given her, the shelter he had built, the daily routines of the 7 days. They asked whether he had attempted to move her from the zone. They asked whether he had made any record of her or transmitted any information about her to outside parties. Cole answered everything directly and without elaboration. He did not perform. He did not try to make himself sound better than he was. He just said what had happened. Then a senior council member, one of the 5 elders in the elevated section, leaned forward and asked a question that the chip delivered very clearly. What did you want from her? Cole was quiet for a moment. Nothing, he said. She asked me why I was alone. I told her the truth. And then I didn't want to leave her alone either. The elder looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then a movement near the side barrier. The council member's attention shifted. Cole looked over. Sarah had stood up. She was small in that large chamber, small and still ash-streaked and thin, standing on all 4 legs with her wings tight against her body. But she stood straight and she looked at the council with an expression that was not frightened. The dark red was gone from her scales. She was running slow deep blue, the sadness color, but underneath it something steady and clear that the chip worked at for a moment before giving Cole a word. Certain. She spoke. Her voice was still young and unformed at the edges, but it carried in the circular chamber better than Cole expected. She spoke in the full dragon language, more of it than Cole had heard from her before, and his chip caught pieces and missed pieces and worked to fill the gaps. But the shape of what she was saying came through clearly enough. She was repeating his words. The words he had said to her on the first night in the ruins. About his unit. About the 6 people who were gone in 4 minutes. About standing frozen in the last moment he felt whole while the rest of the world kept moving. About not knowing how to go back to a life that no longer had them in it. She had remembered every word. She repeated them back now to the council in her own young voice, and the chip caught the dragon language version of them and gave Cole the echo of his own truth translated and returned to him from the mouth of a hatchling who had held on to them for 7 days. When she finished speaking, the chamber was completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting for the next thing. The silence of people who have just heard something that stopped them. Cole looked at the elder in the elevated section. The elder was not looking at him anymore. He was looking at Sarah. And his expression had changed into something that was harder to read than authority or suspicion. It looked, Cole thought, like recognition. The chamber stayed quiet for a long time after Sarah finished speaking. Then the council members began to talk among themselves in low voices, the kind of conversation that happens when a room full of people who were certain about something suddenly find themselves less certain. Cole stood in the center of the open floor and watched it happen and said nothing. There was nothing useful he could add. Sarah had said everything that needed to be said, and she had said it better than he could have. The elder in the elevated section, the one whose expression had shifted when Sarah spoke, raised one hand. The low conversation stopped. He spoke. The chip gave Cole most of it. We will adjourn. The soldier and the hatchling will be placed in separate holding until the council has reviewed the full record and reached a considered decision. Cole did not argue. He looked over at Sarah. She was looking at him. Her scales were running that complicated mix again, the one the chip struggled with. But the pale green was in there. Still there. He held her gaze for a moment and nodded slowly, the way he had learned she understood to mean it is all right. I'm not going anywhere. Her scales flickered gold. Just briefly. Then the soldiers came and Cole was taken to a holding room on the east side of the complex and Sarah was taken somewhere else and a door closed between them. The holding room was plain and functional. A bench along one wall, a water source, a small ventilation unit in the ceiling. Cole sat on the bench and put his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and waited. He was good at waiting. Soldiers learned that early. Waiting was most of the job. What he had not expected was the sound. It came about 20 minutes after he was placed in the room. Faint, coming through the wall to his left, traveling through the stone and metal of the building in a way that changed its shape slightly but not enough to hide what it was. That low mournful sound. The one Sarah had made on the very first night when he told her about his unit. The grief sound. The one that was not quite language but carried more meaning than most words Cole had ever heard. She was in the room next to his. Cole moved to the wall and put his hand flat against it and listened. The sound continued, low and steady, filling the space behind the stone. He could feel it faintly through his palm, a vibration that moved through solid material the way deep sound always does. Then something else happened. The sound traveled further. Beyond Cole's room, beyond the east wing, out into the corridors of the complex. Cole could not see this, but he learned it later from one of the junior council staff who told him quietly, with an expression of someone reporting something they found difficult to explain. The sound moved through the building and everyone who heard it stopped what they were doing. Soldiers paused in corridors. Administrative staff looked up from their work. Even the senior council members who had retired to their deliberation room went still. Nobody who heard it could explain exactly why it affected them that way. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was simply the sound of a small creature that had already lost everything being separated from the one thing it had found since, and something about that particular sound, in that particular frequency, reached through species difference and military training and years of wartime hardness and touched something that did not have a name but was the same in everyone. The complex stayed quiet for a long time after. In the deliberation room, the elder council members sat around a low table with Cole's full record laid out before them. Military files, psychological evaluations, mission logs, communication records. Everything the human peacekeeping force had on Sergeant Cole, pulled and transmitted at the council's formal request. The elder from the elevated section, whose name was Dren, had requested the record himself. He sat at the head of the table and went through it slowly and carefully while the others waited. Dren was the oldest member of the current council. He had been on the council long enough to remember the years before the war, the early period of contact between dragon civilization and the expanding human species, when the relationship between them was being carefully and cautiously built. He remembered the first human delegations. He remembered the long, careful meetings. He remembered thinking back then, that these small short-lived creatures were more complicated than they appeared. The war had buried that memory under a great deal of other things. But it had not erased it. He read Cole's record thoroughly. Then he read it again. Then he sat back and was quiet for a while with his hands folded on the table and his eyes looking at something that was not in the room. The other council members waited. They had learned over many years that when Dren went quiet like that, something worth hearing was coming. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was. Steady and unhurried, each word placed with care, the voice of someone who had learned that how you say something matters almost as much as what you say. He told them what he had found in Cole's record. Not the military details, not the mission logs. The other things. The psychological evaluation filed 3 weeks after the final battle, in which the examining medic had noted that the subject showed signs of unresolved grief and social withdrawal but had not yet reached the threshold for mandatory intervention. The communication logs showing that Cole had sent no personal messages home since the day his unit died. The daily duty reports, filed on time and correctly formatted, that said nothing about what was actually happening to the person writing them. Dren told the council that this was not an unusual profile for a human soldier who had lost a complete unit. He had read enough human psychological literature in the early days of contact to know that what happened to humans after catastrophic loss was well documented if you knew where to look. They did not shut down. That was the thing that most other species did not understand about humans. Most species, when they lost everything, turned inward, withdrew, waited for the wound to close before they tried to move again. Humans did something different. Humans looked outward. They found something outside themselves to focus on, something that needed care, something smaller and more vulnerable than themselves, and they poured into it. Not because they had been trained to. Not because it was logical. But because it was how they kept moving when moving felt impossible. It was how they survived their own grief. Dren had seen it in the record before he read it in the ruins. And then he had seen it in the ruins too, in the way Cole had built a shelter and shared his rations and learned the color language of a dragon hatchling scales. In the way Sarah had repeated his words back to the council, every single one of them held carefully for 7 days, because someone had finally spoken to her like she mattered and she had not wanted to lose a single piece of it. He told the council all of this in the same steady, careful voice. He did not make it dramatic. He did not need to. The facts were dramatic enough on their own. Then he paused. The deliberation room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the building, the last echo of Sarah's sound had faded. But the quality of silence it had left behind was still there, the kind of silence that comes after something true has moved through a space. Dren looked around the table at the faces of his fellow council members. He had known most of them for a very long time. He could read them the way Cole had learned to read Sarah's scale light. He could see that something had shifted. He could see that the certainty they had walked into this deliberation room with was not the same shape it had been before. He said one more thing. His voice did not change. It stayed steady and quiet and unhurried. But the words landed in the room the way heavy things land, with a weight that was felt more than heard. We spent years studying them as a military force. We classified them. We measured them. We decided what they were and what they were capable of, and we built our strategies around that decision. We called them weapons. He paused for just a moment. We never once asked what they do when the war is over. Nobody spoke. They find something to love, Dren said. And they do not leave. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. One by one, around the table, the council members who had walked into the room ready to pass judgment on a human soldier sat with those words and felt the shape of them and understood, slowly and without anyone having to say it out loud, that what they had in front of them was not what they had thought it was. Outside in the east wing, through a wall, Cole sat with his hand flat against the stone and waited. And the decision began to form. The door to the holding room opened and a young council staff member stood in the entrance and told Cole quietly that the council was ready for him. Cole stood up from the bench and rolled his shoulders and followed the staff member back through the corridors of the complex. The building felt different from when he had walked through it the first time. He could not immediately identify why. Then he realized. People were looking at him differently. The soldiers they passed in the corridors did not look at him with the flat, suspicious assessment they had used before. They looked at him with something else. Not warmth exactly. But not suspicion either. Something in between that did not yet have a shape but was clearly moving in a direction. He was brought back into the council chamber. It looked the same as before. The wide circular space, the tiered seating, the high ceiling built for creatures larger than him. The council members in their places. Elder Dren in the elevated section at the far end. But Sarah was already there. She was standing in the center of the open floor, the place where Cole had stood during the questioning. She was not in the side section behind the barrier anymore. She was in the middle of the room, and when the door opened and Cole walked in, she turned and looked at him, and her scales ran immediately and completely bright gold. She crossed the floor to him faster than he had ever seen her move. Not quite running, her legs were still young and a little unsteady, but close enough to it. She pressed herself against his legs and made a sound that was not the grief sound and not the curiosity sound, but something warmer than either, something the chip did not fully translate because it was not quite language. It was just sound that meant him. Sound that meant found. Cole put his hand on her head carefully. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture did not already cover. Elder Dren spoke from the elevated section. Cole stood straight and listened, and the chip worked steadily, giving him the words cleanly and in full because Dren spoke slowly and with precision, the way someone speaks when they want to be sure they are understood. The council had reviewed the full record. The council had considered the testimony given in the previous session, including the testimony given by the hatchling herself. The council had deliberated at length and had reached a unanimous decision. Sergeant Cole was cleared of all accusations. Every charge that had been formally raised, the unauthorized presence in the zone, the failure to report through proper channels, the alleged holding of a hatchling against her will, was withdrawn completely and without condition. The record would reflect that his actions in the post-war zone had been consistent with the peacekeeping mandate and with something beyond the mandate, something the council acknowledged required a different kind of language to describe properly. Cole nodded once. He kept his expression steady the way he had been trained to in formal settings. But his hand on Sarah's head pressed slightly firmer and she leaned into it. Then Dren said there was a second matter. He spoke for a while, laying the foundation carefully the way Cole had noticed he always did, building toward something instead of simply arriving at it. He spoke about dragon law and the specific language within it that governed the bonds between members of a clutch family. He spoke about a title that existed within that law, old language, rarely used even within dragon society because the circumstances that called for it were rare. A title given not by blood but by choice. Not by birth but by the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. A guardian bonded to a hatchling through action rather than biology. The title was Varric Soul. In the old tongue it meant chosen flame keeper. Dren said that the council had debated whether the title could apply outside dragon species. There was no precedent. The law had never been written with other species in mind because the situation had never arisen before. But law, Dren said in the same steady quiet voice, was written to describe what was true. And what was true was that this human soldier had stayed in the ruins with this hatchling for 7 days and fed her and sheltered her and learned the language of her scales, and she had pressed herself against his legs and trusted him and repeated his words to a full council chamber from memory because she had held them like something precious. The law had a word for that. The species of the people involved did not change what the word described. Cole was the first non-dragon in recorded history to be granted the title of Varric Soul. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then something happened that Cole had not expected. The council members, all of them, placed their right hands flat against the left side of their chests in a gesture that the chip did not translate because it was not language. It was older than language. Cole did not know what it meant in its full context, but he understood the shape of it. The same way you understand certain things without being taught them. He looked down at Sarah. She was looking up at him with those large gold-reflected eyes, and her scales were running the warmest gold he had ever seen on her, brighter than the first time, brighter than any of the times before. The days that followed were busy in the practical way that transitions always are. Arrangements were made. A dragon clutch family within the regional community had agreed to take Sarah in, a family with 2 older hatchlings who had also lost members in the war and had space and willingness to grow. Sarah would be raised among her own kind, learning the full dragon language and culture and everything she needed to grow into who she was supposed to be. The council was clear that this was right, and Cole agreed with them. He had never thought otherwise. But the title of Varric Soul was written formally into the family arrangement. Cole had full visitation rights. He would be consulted on decisions affecting Sarah's care. He was invited to remain in the region in his capacity as a human peacekeeping liaison, a role that had quietly been created to keep him nearby without anyone having to say directly that keeping him nearby was the point. Cole sent a message home. He sat in the small room the complex had given him for the transition period, and he opened a personal communication channel for the first time since the day his unit died, and he wrote to his family. Not a duty report. Not the kind of careful nothing message that soldiers send when they want people to stop worrying without actually telling them anything. A real message. He told them he was staying a while longer. He told them he had found something he had not been looking for, and he was not ready to walk away from it yet. He told them he was going to be alright, and for the first time in a long time when he said it he believed it was true. On the last evening before Sarah moved to her new clutch family, Cole and Sarah sat together outside on a flat section of ground near the edge of the complex where the walls were low enough that you could see the open land beyond. The alien sky above them was doing what it always did at evening, the greenish-gray deepening and shifting, the low heavy light softening into something almost gentle. It was not the sky Cole had grown up under. It was the wrong color and the wrong weight, and the stars that would come out later were in the wrong places. But he had been looking at it long enough that it had stopped feeling wrong and started feeling like something he knew. Sarah sat close against his side. She had grown slightly even in these few weeks, Cole thought. Or maybe it was just that she was holding herself differently. Less small. Less folded in. They sat without talking for a while the way they had learned to do, comfortable in the quiet together. Then Sarah looked up at him and her scales shifted into the gentle asking color, the pale silver that meant a question was coming. She spoke. The chip caught it clearly. Will you be alone again? Cole looked at her. He looked at this small creature who had asked him a question in the ruins that nobody else had thought to ask and had listened to his answer and held every word of it carefully for 7 days. Who had pressed herself against his legs in front of a patrol ship because the color of trust on her scales did not know how to lie. Who had stood up in a formal council chamber, thin and ash-streaked and small, and spoken his truth back to the people who needed to hear it. He thought about the 6 people who were gone. He thought about standing frozen in the last moment he felt whole. He thought about the message he had sent home and the arrangement papers with his name on them and the new word in an old language that now belonged to him. He shook his head. Not anymore, he said quietly. Sarah's scales ran gold. The brightest gold. The kind that looked, in the fading alien light, like the last warmth before dark. Cole stayed beside her until the stars came out in all the wrong places and the night settled full and quiet around them. And for the first time since the war ended he did not feel like a man standing in a moment that had already passed. He felt like a man at the beginning of something. They had built humans for war and studied them as weapons and never thought to ask what a weapon does when it finally lays itself down. The answer, had anyone thought to look, was written in the ruins of a dragon nesting ground where a soldier sat in the ash and told the truth to a hatchling who needed to hear it. They find something to love. And they stay.